So the British Mandate was kind of a euphemism for the British colony of Palestine. How this was part of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, or kind of came afterwards, where I was telling you that at first Israel, or what is Palestine, and what was Palestine then was considered an international zone, was eventually handed over to the British by the League of Nations. If you don't know, the League of Nations, which you can always click on, was a precursor to the United Nations. It was a failure for a variety of ways, but it was the first attempt to have an international kind of body to discuss and address the concerns of the world, if you will, to avoid larger conflict. So because of the issues going on in Palestine, the League of Nations, it gave Britain kind of control, if you will, of Palestine, which went into effect in 1923. Now, textbooks, etc., say that a mandate is like a colony, only not quite a colony. Okay, fine. But essentially it was a colony. So while a colony might have put Britain in British officials running Palestine, they didn't necessarily pick British officials to run Palestine, literally, but maybe the British officials made sure that whatever was happening in Palestine was what they wanted. So a mandate is like a colony, but with a little bit more freedom, if you will. My point here is that the Palestinians did not have control over what they wanted, nor did the Jews. So if you think back to the Jeds and Pads activity, and you were to convince the great power who should get the land, Britain was the great power. They're the ones who would decide who gets the land. So if you see in this map, this dark, I would call orange, I suppose, the British said Jews could settle in, which is, as you can see, this is modern day Israel. This is literally the borders of modern day Israel. But this is also Palestine. And then you can see in what was called Transjordan at the time, but is now just called Jordan, Jews were not allowed to settle there. Eventually they were, but not yet. So during the British Mandate, Zionists really, really tried to convince the Britain to have there be a national homeland. As we talked about, the British had already issued the Balfour Declaration committing themselves to a homeland, but just because you wrote it in a letter doesn't mean it happened. So the Zionists were trying to lobby is just a way to say officially pressure. They're trying to pressure Britain to officially make that happen, to make Palestine a state for the Jews. And Britain didn't do it. Britain didn't do it because the Palestinians were very angry, and there was a lot of violence and outrage because the way the Palestinians saw it, this was their land. And why were they going to give it to a whole group of people they weren't even at their borders? So let's think about this for a minute. Think about the United States, say, not wanting Mexicans in. I'm oversimplifying, but let's say that. And I know there's a lot of us who are very sympathetic to the cause, the Mexicans, and trying to give them the immigrants a right to stay here. But in this case, Palestinians, the Jews were not even at their borders, right? They weren't even necessarily refugees. They weren't fleeing. While some things in Europe were difficult for Jews in some pockets, it wasn't like there was a massive war going on at the time. It wasn't as if there was a natural disaster. It wasn't as if there was an economic problem. It was just that Jews were wanting to return to the land that they said God had promised them. So while you may or may not be sympathetic for that, I just try to ask for you to put yourself in Palestinian shoes. How would you feel, or how would Americans feel, or how would somebody feel if a whole group of people wanted to move into your country or your house or your neighborhood and say this was theirs and for the taking? I'm just trying to get you to think about things. I'm not trying to take a side so much as just trying to get in the heads of why the Palestinians might be so upset about this massive Jewish immigration coming into their land and the threat they might have felt.